Your readers are probably lost, so let's fix that.
Yeah, take it from someone who's an expert at losing his audience.
Oh, and how's your audience, bud?
Whatever audience you think you have is thanks to me, and we all know it. Now, get to it.
Wow, okay. Well, recently I was working with two client writers who were working on very different projects. One was working on a dissertation, it's the most academic of academic documents, and the other was working on an ambitious mixed-genre memoir, about as inventive and creative as you could get. But for as different as those two projects were, after I had read their work and we were talking about my feedback, it was clear that both writers were dealing with the same kind of problem. The structure of their writing was all but invisible to their readers. Both projects were full of interesting ideas and sentences, but both projects were also confusing. They were harder to get into than they needed to be, and they were less purposeful than they could have been. For me, as a reader, it maybe felt like getting a box of furniture parts and then opening it up to start assembling the bookshelf, only to find out that the instructions were missing. I did have a sense that all the parts for a really interesting project were present in both of them, but I didn't really know how to put those pieces together. From one paragraph to the next, the pieces were saying things, but I just wasn't sure what to do with any of it. And I mentioned these two projects mostly because they were so different. But to be honest, I could say the same thing about a lot of the pieces I review with clients. The primary issue in a lot of writing isn't the quality of the prose, the rigor of the supporting theory, or the depth of the research. It's that the structure hasn't been made clear to a reader. And that makes it so much harder for a reader to understand and then consequently to care about what you have to say. So I want to show you two primary ways to make the structure of your ideas clearer to your readers so that your writing can do its job more effectively. Of course, if you're looking for more individualized help, I do offer consultations and you can find more information in the description. But now that you understand the root of the problem, let's get to solutions.
About time.
Oh, we're not even a page into the script. I think you're fine.
I've never been fine, and I don't see why I'd start today.
Well, that's up to you. But let's talk about typographical signposts, or the ways that you can format your document so that readers will have an easier time making sense of it. Now, the most obvious are section headers. In a play, you'll have acts and scenes. In a novel, you'll have chapters. And in a research paper, you'll have a method section and a discussion section, for example. These might seem obvious, but they're so obvious that we may run the risk of not talking about them and just assuming that everyone knows what to do. So let's take a quick look at a standard template for research writing. You may have heard of IMRAD. It's a handy acronym that stands for Introduction, Methods, Results, Analysis, Discussion. Once you've done your experiment or study or whatever you were up to, this is a common model for reporting your findings, and often research papers are directly broken into sections with these labels. And again, it may be obvious, but these labels help readers to navigate the document. Imagine you'd done research on the migration patterns of a few dozen bird species, correlated that data with forest density, and connected that to climate patterns over the last half-decade. That's a lot of information to throw at your reader, and if you just start talking about it all, they might feel overwhelmed. But simply breaking it up into 5 labeled sections makes it clear to the reader what they're dealing with in each of those sections. If, in the introduction, you spend a few pages just talking about previous research, well, because it's labeled, your reader won't wonder why. They'll know it's the introduction, and they can more easily figure out why you're telling them what you're telling them. You're talking about previous research as a way to introduce the need for your own study. In the humanities, a lot of older articles especially don't have any section headings. And as a result, they're such a chore to read compared to newer ones that do have them. When sections are labeled, I know what each section contains, and I can navigate the text and understand it more efficiently. So of course, labeled headings are useful, but be careful. I have seen writers wander into unfortunate directions once they've unlocked the power of headings. One is that they just put in too many. In the most extreme case, I once had a student put a heading label on every paragraph. And that's just not helpful because A, paragraph breaks are already a functional signpost, and you don't need a redundant layer of signaling on top of that. And B, when every paragraph is its own labeled section, we lose the chance to show relationships between paragraphs. See, a section called analysis not only tells us about the content and what's different from the rest of the paper, but it also tells us that everything in that section contributes to the purpose of analyzing the data. Why are we talking about statistical formulas in this paragraph? Well, to help us analyze the data. Useful headings group parts of a document together, not only to signal what you have to say, but why you're saying it. too many small sections can obscure connections as much as they emphasize divisions. But the other key is that the labels you apply should actually tell a reader something. Now, as a creative and artistic soul, you might want to be creative with section headers, but to be honest, a header that says introduction is so much more useful than one that says, "As I pondered the fate of the birds." Yeah, it's not as fun, but it does actually tell the reader what to expect, so that they'll know how to handle the information that they will encounter in that section. So consider useful divisions and labels in your own work. For a lot of projects, just numbering chapters may be enough to give your readers a sense of structure. But what if you gave the chapters titles? Chapter 1, The Monster Awakes. Chapter 2, Into the Desert, and whatever else. With narrative fiction, the force of chronology is usually enough to hold things together in a coherent and comprehensible structure. But if you're doing something experimental or playing with time or point of view, then labeled chapters could go a long way. But even if you don't go as far as labeling your sections, just breaking things up can be a huge benefit. Every so often, I'll have a student turn in an essay that has no paragraph breaks. It's just running text from beginning to end, and genuinely, those end up being the most incomprehensible papers, because those students have delivered a lot of information, but haven't given any shape to it. Does this idea go with that idea or the one that came before it? I don't know, and there aren't any typographical helps or line breaks or indents to help me see those relationships. Or, because I can't miss a chance to talk about Gerard Manley Hopkins, just look at his poem, God's Grandeur. Now, listen, we've talked before about how Hopkins can be difficult to understand. In this piece, he's going on about foil and oil and toil and the brown brink eastward, and all that strangeness could really throw a reader for a loop. But look, the poem is divided into 2 sections. And even if you don't know that this is a sonnet with 8 lines that introduce an idea and 6 lines that pivot to something new, you can still see clearly and typographically that this poem has 2 parts. So if you're overwhelmed by the poem, just start with the first section. What are the first 8 lines about? The world is charged with the grandeur of God, but people don't seem to care. The whole world is seared, smeared, smudged with the passing of generations and the labors of people. You know, the factories and the pollution and the bulldozed forests to make room for low-cost housing and data centers, which were all the rage in the 19th century. That's what this section is about. Hopkins sees God's greatness in creation, but he laments the fact that human industry both destroys that creation and alienates us from it. So what does section 2 add to that? Well, it's not labeled, but we already know 2 important things just because there's a break. First, because it is part of the same poem, obviously it's going to contribute to the argument that Hopkins has started. But second, because it is a separate section, it's going to say something different from the ideas in the first. They are related, but they're rhetorically and visually distinct. And when we get into it, Hopkins says that the greatness of creation isn't totally overcome by human industry, and that even after night takes over, the morning still comes in the east. So yes, humans have done a number on planet Earth, but Hopkins hopes that nature is more resilient than all that. It's a short piece, but I think it would be just a little more difficult for a new reader if not for the division between the first and second sections. Thanks to that break, we can see, even before we read the words, that the first 8 lines have something in common that the last 6 lines don't. And little breaks like that can do a lot for your own writing too. Put some extra space in your essay to show that you're moving to a new idea. Put a break and maybe even an asterism in your novel to show a time skip. This may not be new stuff for you, but never underestimate the value of breaking things up so that your reader doesn't have to do the work on their own of figuring out what does and doesn't go together, especially because they might get it wrong if you're not directing them with some clear typographical guidance. But that brings us to our second strategy, which I'll call discursive signposting. There's a joke that never gets old that academic writing works by telling your reader what you're going to tell them, telling it to them, and then telling them what you just told them.
Never gets old because it started out old.
Well, it's funny because it's true, but there's also a good reason for that. If you're working your way through mountains of data or a difficult theoretical framework, you want to make sure that your reader doesn't get lost. And that's why you'll see signal phrases like "this paper will argue that," or "now that we've established X, we'll examine the role of Y." Again, the key of all that we're talking about today is that, of course, your reader needs to know what you have to say, but they also need to know why you're saying it. Oh, I needed to understand how climate was affecting forest growth before I could understand how deforestation was affecting bird migration. And maybe I could have figured out that connection on my own, but it's just so much easier that you just said it outright and made it explicit. Because the people who read academic articles are usually reading quickly and looking for specific information, explicitly saying why you're saying something meets those readers' needs really effectively. But it's not just academic papers. Hopkins does it too. After that first stanza about how apparently ruined nature is, the second stanza begins with, "And for all this, nature is never spent." For all what? For all the stuff he just said. Even in this poem, we get an explicit transition phrase. In an academic paper, it might sound more like, despite the damaging effects of human industry on natural systems, our findings suggest that such systems are more resilient than previously thought. In what follows, we will examine the evidence for that resilience. So obviously the way poets and academics do it will be different, but the rhetorical effect is the same. In addition to the typographical breaks that make structure visually obvious, add a discursive signal that explains explicitly how your ideas relate to each other. And here's a quick example. You could just write something like this. The dog barked. The doorbell rang. Now that clearly tells us what happened, but it doesn't tell us anything about the relationship between those events. So what about this? The dog barked because the doorbell rang. Or this. Despite the dog's barking, the doorbell rang. Or this. The dog was always barking, independent of the doorbell's ringing. Or even this. The dog barked every time the doorbell rang. And you get the idea. There are things you can do in your writing to make the relationship between your ideas explicitly clear. But a lot of new writers just put ideas next to each other and then leave their poor readers to figure it out on their own. It happened with the two clients I mentioned at the beginning, and it happens all the time with students. And there are probably a few reasons it might happen. One is that there's a really strange attitude among writers that being straightforward is somehow less artistic or rigorous. We get so used to being confused by 500-year-old poems in high school that we think poems have to be inscrutable. We get so overwhelmed by the unfamiliar jargon in academic writing when we're sophomores that we think research papers have to be opaque when we get to grad school. But to that, I'd say first, things are going to be harder to understand when you're new at them. It makes sense that you struggled with your first experiences with poetry, the same way that someone struggles with their first experience riding a bike. But just because you wobbled when you first rode a bike, that doesn't mean that you should go on to design wobbly bikes. The wobble was a part of your learning process, not a design feature of the product. And second, there just are writers out there who have done a bad job and were published anyway. But the existence of bad academic writing does not mean that you can't do better. So just say the thing and make the relationships between your ideas clear and explicit, and then your readers will thank you, which will also make your ideas more influential because, after all, being understood comes before making a difference. Now, another reason someone might not be making the structure of their writing explicit is because it already feels obvious to them. And this gets back to the enduring challenge of seeing your writing the way a reader will see it. Whatever you're writing, poem, novel, dissertation, you're deep in the world, the data, the ideas. You've thought about your project for a long time, so the relationships between your ideas and the design of your document is second nature. But your reader doesn't know your project as well as you do. Imagine, for example, that you're a chef and you've designed a recipe for a complex dessert. You could just say, bake the cake until it's done. But a less experienced cook, someone who didn't develop the recipe or doesn't know exactly what the final result is supposed to be like, may not know exactly what done means. So you could make your intention explicitly clear. Bake until golden brown and a tester inserted near the center comes out clean. That's not condescending, it's helpful. And of course, it's possible that the structure of your writing isn't explicitly clear to a reader because it's not explicitly clear to you yet either. In an early draft, you might still be figuring things out. You do have a general sense of what you have to say, but you haven't quite worked out the shape of those ideas or the best way to present them. And that's okay, but you'll want to figure that out before you put your work out there. And there's hardly a better tool for that than an outline. So if you're just going through draft after draft, maybe take a step back and try translating your project into an outline. Turn each paragraph or stanza or section into a shorter summary of itself in order to get a bird's eye view of how your project is really put together. That'll give you an easier time seeing the structure when you're not stuck on the details of every word in every paragraph, and it will help you spot places where you can adjust, reorder, or even cut. Remember, the goal of all of this is to serve your reader, to make it easier for them to understand what you have to say, because that will ultimately serve you. Your research or your story or your argument limits its reach unnecessarily when it's harder to understand than it needs to be. And making your structure explicitly clear is an invaluable way to help your reader to understand what you have to say. In fact, as we've talked about elsewhere on the show, ancient rhetoric was organized into 5 canons that addressed different aspects of the composing process. Invention was concerned with the development of ideas and arguments. It was about figuring out what you had to say. But arrangement, figuring out how to structure what you had to say, and communicating that structure to your audience was just as important. You could fail to persuade your audience by having a bad argument, but even a good argument with an ineffective structure could fail just as easily. Now, I wanted to be kind of quick about this.
So you immediately took the slowest path through the subject.
So we didn't look at an exhaustive variety of examples, but I hope the principle is still clear. Make your structure explicitly clear, which you can do typographically, by putting visual markers of structure in the document, and discursively, which means using language that tells your readers how your ideas relate to each other. Now, the actual execution will look different depending on what you're writing, but the usefulness of clear structure remains consistent, whether you're writing a dissertation or experimental literature. Now, go enjoy a week playing with structure, and again, check out my feedback and consultation services in the description if you're having trouble working through your own project. Either way, have a great week, and we'll see you again soon.